All right, everyone. Well, we will go ahead and get started this fine afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so happy to have you here. My name is Eileen McKeevers, and I am the Clean Cars Organizer at Interfaith Power and Light's National Office. Today, we will be taking a deep dive into transportation inequity and how we can build a new, just transportation system that works for everyone. I will be your host today, so just a couple housekeeping things before we begin. Firstly, please use the Q&A feature for any questions that you might have. You can drop your questions in as we go, and we'll get to them at the end of the discussion. And please use the Q&A feature for questions only, and the chat for any comments that you might like to share with us or other attendees. Also, we are currently recording this webinar, and we will be sharing the recording with you either later today or tomorrow, as well as any relevant links from the webinar in an email. All right, well, I will introduce Kevin. We are absolutely thrilled to have him here today. Kevin is from EVHybridNoire, which is one of the country's leading EV equity organizations. Kevin is the Western States Program Manager for EVHybridNoire. And in his role, he manages the organization's e-mobility and environmental justice projects in the Western US. His prior career has included work as a transportation engineer in the LA Department of Transportation, a program management fellow at International Justice Mission, and a strategy associate at Platypus Advisors. Kevin holds a BS from UCLA in civil and environmental engineering and an MBA from the UCLA Anderson School of Management. Again, thank you so much for being here, Kevin. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Eileen, and thank you everyone for being here today to learn a little bit more about what's happening in the electric vehicle space, specifically with regards to equity. So go ahead and share my screen. And can you guys all see this properly?
Looks great.
Awesome. All right. Great. So as I mentioned, my name is Kevin Bai. I am the Western States Program Manager at EVHybridNoire. We are the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts, and our mission is to advance electric vehicles and multimodal e-mobility solutions, such as electric buses, bikes, etc., across the US, and ensure that those solutions are both inclusive and equitable. We do that by engaging with communities who are often left out of the e-mobility discussion, advocating for e-mobility solutions in underserved communities, and shifting the narrative about e-mobility to be more inclusive of diverse populations. So I'm excited to be here with you today to present on equity in the electric vehicle space. During our presentation, we'll talk about the historical context of EVs and charging infrastructure, and how past historical discriminatory practices have shaped our society today that is now transitioning to electric vehicles. We'll also discuss some of the inequities within the electric vehicle space that are happening now, and how we can ensure that we employ solutions that reverse those inequities moving forward. We'll also have time have some time at the end for questions and further discussion. So feel free to utilize the chat and drop in your questions as they come up, and we'd be happy to answer it. So to begin, I'd like to give a brief introduction of just the electric vehicle landscape and where we are right now. So the electric vehicle market is currently growing at an exponential rate and will revolutionize the transportation industry. So I'm based in Los Angeles. So in my home state of California, currently more than 1 in 5 vehicles purchased in 2023 have been zero emission EVs. California has also hit the milestone of 1.5 million EVs sold just a couple months ago, which was a target that we weren't hoping to reach until 2025. Meanwhile, the California Energy Commission has dedicated $2.9 billion starting in December of 2022 to expand EV charging in the state. Meanwhile, at the national level, the federal government has allocated $7.5 billion to deploy EV charging in communities and along major connecting freeway corridors. through a program called NEVI, which stands for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. So there's clearly a lot of money and progress being made in the EV space in just the last few years. And these actions will only accelerate in the coming years as EVs become cheaper and also more widely accessible to consumers. However, as we make this transition to electric vehicles, it's important that we consider the issue of equity as it relates to transportation and mobility. We need to ensure that this transition is equitable and accessible to all communities, including communities of color who have been historically marginalized and left out of the conversation. So now, in order to talk about equity, first, let's understand what equality means. So equality means that each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. On the other hand, equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. And this is something that we can see from the graphic on the left, where people have different needs in order to ride a bicycle in the same way. So when it comes to our transportation system, taking an equity lens includes recognizing that the transportation system has not provided the same resources and opportunities to individuals from different communities, and that there are differing levels of resourcing and support that are needed to ensure that every community is included and experiences the same benefits in the transition to electric vehicles. Unfortunately, there have been these historical inequities that have targeted certain communities and created an uneven playing field in the US. One of the prime examples of inequitable discriminatory practices in the past that still has impacts on our society today is redlining. So what is redlining? Redlining was the systematic denial of services such as mortgages, insurance loans, and other financial tools to residents of certain areas based on their race or ethnicity. This practice made it more expensive, if not impossible, for Black Americans across the country to be approved for things like mortgages to purchase a home. As a result, Black Americans were either unable to purchase a home and forced to continue to rent, or they were targeted by the banks with subprime loans that had higher interest rates. Now you might be thinking, how are past discriminatory real estate practices relevant to the transition to EVs taking place today? Well, I'll give you two examples. The first is infrastructure. So recall the billions of dollars that I had mentioned both the California government and the federal government are spending to accelerate the installation of EV charging stations in the coming years. Well, those stations do have to go in physical locations, and they are going to primarily benefit communities that live in the surrounding area. And because historical housing policies led to cities that were oftentimes segregated along racial lines that persist to this day, the location of charging infrastructure is going to play a huge role in who actually gets to benefit from those government investments in EV charging. If we look at the map on the right, which is a map of Austin, Texas, we see that the red areas are the neighborhoods that were targeted with redlining back in the 1900s. A quick look on PlugShare at the map of EV charging stations today in Austin, and we can see some of the same zones that were redlined in the eastern part of Austin and the southwest neighborhoods are also areas that have sparse amounts of EV charging available today. So we can see that the impact of redlining has persisted beyond the laws themselves that originally allowed it. The second reason that redlining is still important today relates to financial tools. The US banking industry clearly does not have a good history of fair money lending practices as we have seen in the past. And not only are homes oftentimes financed with mortgages, but vehicles are also oftentimes financed with car loans. So with EVs having a higher upfront cost than traditional gas vehicles, car loans are going to be vital to the purchase of EVs. And we need to ensure that communities of color have equal and fair access to these financial tools as well. In addition to redlining, another example of past inequitable practices and policies in transportation is the building and siting of freeways and highways. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a quick video clip from The Daily Show of what this process looked like, and then I'll elaborate on it after the video plays.
The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 was one of the largest public works projects in American history. It added 41,000 miles to our interstate system.
Pretty much every major city in the country, New York, DC, San Francisco, Philadelphia, you have major highways cutting through neighborhoods, requiring the demolition of lots of housing and other sorts of buildings.
That as they're thinking about where they're going to drop highways and destroy neighborhoods, they invariably single out what they see as the worst neighborhoods in their communities.
It became a pattern in cities across the country. Poor and minority residents were displaced to make way for highways, and white residents used those highways to commute into the city for jobs and commute back home at night.
Planners had an uncanny ability to pick out the black neighborhoods. The route for I-94 in St. Paul displaced 1 in 7 of the city's black residents. Very few blacks were living in Minnesota, one critic noted, but the road builders found them.
So as we can see from this video, those in charge of designing and siting the US freeway system were deliberate in their work to build highways to the detriment of Black communities within the city. Many Black communities were entirely displaced from their neighborhoods as the freeway construction took place straight through their communities. Those that were not displaced in the surrounding neighborhood were left to suffer the consequences of being located near a busy and polluting freeway. As a result of many of these inequities that I've mentioned, that what we have today are communities that have been disproportionately hurt by structurally discriminatory practices in the transportation field. From diminished economic opportunity and the ability to build generational wealth to divided and displaced communities, these practices have left their mark on what the US looks like today and shaped the conversation around how can we transition to electric vehicles equitably. So now that we have an understanding of some past discriminatory policies that have shaped our society today, let's get into electric vehicles and the benefits of them. So one of the major upsides of EVs is the impact on air pollution and vehicular smog and the health of individuals and communities. So EVs do not emit any tailpipe emissions and are better for the environment, not just at a global level in terms of climate change and the reduction of CO2 emissions, but also at the local community level. Unlike their gasoline counterparts, EVs don't emit nitrous oxides, carbon monoxide, PM 2.5, and other components of car engine exhaust into the communities that they drive directly through. So this is really important when it comes to racial equity in the area of health. Research today shows that the communities that are hit hardest by air pollution and vehicular smog from gasoline vehicles are primarily lower income communities of color. These communities frequently have freeways, ports, polluting factories located nearby that contaminate the environment and lead to poor air quality that these communities, their children, their families actually breathe. These elevated levels of air pollution that low-income communities face have immediate effects on the human body, such as shortness of breath and lightheadedness, but also can actually lead to long-term health consequences, such as asthma, cardiovascular, and respiratory diseases. It's estimated that exposure to poor air quality is responsible for up to 30,000 premature deaths per year in the US. However, the transition to EVs represents an opportunity to address these inequities. Electric vehicles have that potential to reduce air pollution, especially in low-income areas, and lead to overall better health outcomes for everyone involved. There's a recent study that shows that even the smaller early stage increases in EV adoption that we've already seen in California have led to less hospital ER trips related to respiratory illnesses that we often see as a correlated result of breathing air pollution. By starting to electrify our vehicles, the communities of color that have been most negatively impacted, the most at risk of air pollution, can begin to breathe easier and healthier and avoid more of these trips to the ER that are unnecessary, honestly. So now that we understand some of the importance of the benefits of EVs, I want to take a look at a few of the inequities that are persisting in this transition today. So while the transition to EVs presents an opportunity to promote equity in transportation, there are also some major challenges and pitfalls that we need to address. The areas that I'll discuss today are around EV affordability, EV charging infrastructure, and EV awareness and knowledge. So the first challenge is EV affordability. So while the price of new electric vehicles has been trending downwards over the past few years, EVs are currently still more expensive than traditional gas-powered vehicles. And the price difference can make it difficult. For low-income households to make that switch. Unfortunately, the auto industry is also not making it any easier on low-income consumers. Large, higher-end vehicles like the Hummer EV by GM or the Tesla Cybertruck are making headlines with their massive automobile bodies and large battery packs. Yet these vehicles are priced above the average cost of a luxury vehicle and out of reach for many. Meanwhile, the Chevy Bolt, which is one of the lowest cost EVs on the market today that can be purchased for under $30,000, will unfortunately see its production cut by GM by the end of this year. Combine these facts with the higher priced vehicles with historical challenges of Black and Brown communities to access financing options that we have previously mentioned. And it's pretty clear that there is a major barrier for low-income communities of color to get in on this EV transition. The next challenge is a lack of infrastructure investments. So there are still many areas without adequate charging infrastructure, particularly in disadvantaged communities, both urban and rural. So EV charging infrastructure is often built in more affluent areas, providing more access to higher income individuals living in urban settings who are already more likely to be homeowners and have home charging readily available. An example of this is in Manhattan, where a survey of charging stations done in adjacent neighborhoods showed this vast disparity. So in the Upper East Side, a high-income white neighborhood where a majority of the population are homeowners, there are 70 public chargers listed, whereas just a few miles away in East Harlem, where it's low income and much more diverse and consists primarily of people renting their homes, there are only 7 chargers identified. This lack of infrastructure can limit the accessibility of EVs to certain communities and create an adoption gap that oftentimes falls along racial lines. Additionally, there is also an equity concern for those who live in more rural areas. So EV charging investments have been focused on the urban setting thus far. And as someone who lives in Los Angeles, which has the most EV chargers in the nation, I've recognized the disparities when I look on a map on PlugShare and realize that my neighborhood has more public chargers than some states do. These are challenges that are going to be crucial for our country to resolve to ensure that EVs can be driven by all communities, urban, rural, Black, white, Asian, Latino, all of these communities, and not just some based on where they live and work. So lastly, there are awareness and education gaps that need to be addressed as well. So data on EV ownership shows that EVs are more likely to be owned and driven by higher income white individuals, allowing them to reap the benefits of that cleaner air that we mentioned, and not to mention lower fuel costs and maintenance costs from EVs, instead of those who face the most severe health disparities and are in greater need of better air quality, such as low-income communities of color. Based on EVHybridNoire's past research, the most likely demographic to be EV owners are middle-aged white men earning more than $100,000 annually with a college degree or higher. This is despite the fact that studies have also shown that communities of color are actually more open and willing to adopt zero-emission vehicles than those white communities that oftentimes do. Another research study that EVHybridNoire recently conducted was with Consumer Reports that show that there is a positive correlation between experience with riding or driving EVs and the willingness to purchase an EV as their next vehicle. So experience can entail riding or driving in a friend or family member's EV, but it can also entail things like taking a rideshare trip in an EV or conducting a test drive at a dealership or through a ride and drive EV event. So given that data, it would make sense that the individuals who are most connected to the majority of current EV drivers, a population that is predominantly white and higher income, are more likely to be the next round of EV owners. So without intentional action by both the government, nonprofits, the auto industry, to connect with a more diverse audience that includes individuals from disadvantaged communities, it's easy to see how EVs will continue to be majority owned by the populations that are not the most impacted by air pollution and transportation inequity, as we highlighted at the start of the webinar. So now that we've identified some of the challenges facing the electric vehicle market in terms of equity, let's explore some strategies that can help overcome these barriers. So the first thing we discussed was EV affordability as a problem and a barrier. However, there are plenty of reasons for optimism in the future for EV affordability. As we can see from this chart, over 2/3 of all car sales each year are transactions involving used vehicles. So as EVs become more widespread and adopted by individuals, families, even governments and corporations, more EVs will enter the used car market at a price point that is affordable for all socioeconomic communities. And an example that we can think about here is with rideshare companies. So Uber and Lyft have been mandated by the government of California to only utilize zero-emission vehicles by 2030 in the state. Meanwhile, they have a goal of utilizing 100% zero-emission vehicles by 2035 across the rest of the US and Canada. With the abundance of Ubers and Lyfts on the road transitioning to EVs, these cars will all eventually move to the used car market en masse, allowing for more options for used car buyers and being able to have lower price points that are just more accessible to everyone. So in addition, governments at all levels, from the federal to the local, are offering EV incentives targeted towards low-income families. So on this slide, you can see a list of the EVs that are expected to qualify for the federal tax credit, as well as some of the EVs that do not at the bottom of the screen. So these EV incentive programs include income qualifying tax credits and subsidies for the purchase of used and new EVs, and even there are even some incentives for home EV charging. So currently, how the federal tax credit works is that the buyer will get the credit on the following year's tax returns. However, oftentimes, especially low-income families, don't have that money up front to pay for the car and then wait until almost a whole year to receive that money back in a tax return. So one of the equity-focused changes that are actually coming to the federal EV incentives program is that starting in 2024, tax credits can actually be turned into a point of sale rebate so that the buyer doesn't have to wait until the following year's tax return to be able to benefit from the tax credit money. This is crucial for lower income families that may not have that money up front, and is an equity-focused change that we're looking forward to seeing starting next year. So as for the infrastructure, fortunately, what we've seen from the federal government has been a renewed focus on ensuring that disadvantaged communities are not left out of the equation. So through adoption of policies like Justice 40, which is a federal mandate that 40% of EV charging investments must go towards serving disadvantaged communities, there is hope that these communities won't be left behind by future investments in EV infrastructure. For example, the NEVI program that I had previously mentioned, the federal government is mandated to ensure that 40% of that $7.5 billion of funding will go directly to benefit disadvantaged communities. As a part of this initiative, the federal government has laid out a Justice 40 map, which you can see on the left side of the screen. This map lays out which communities are most disadvantaged and can qualify under the Justice 40 guidelines. So as contractors and outsourced companies look to apply for these grants to install charging stations, they'll be utilizing this map to make sure that their investments are going to benefit these disadvantaged communities, and so that we can instill more equity in the rollout of that government funding. In addition, every day there are more companies that are also signing on to installing EV charging infrastructure at their sites. So for example, Walmart recently made the news last month because they'll be installing fast charging stations at thousands of their store locations in the coming years. Subway and 7-Eleven are also joining in and have made similar investments as well. The hope is that through a combination of both public and private investments coming from the federal government, from the local state government and cities, and private corporations, and even some nonprofits, we'll be able to see a level of saturation that the EV charging landscape will be available to all communities, whether rural, urban, low income, higher income areas. Everyone will be able to have access to charging in their neighborhoods, whether it's at your local Walmart or through a Tesla supercharging station or through a government funded public charging station. So finally, the last area to address in terms of EV inequities that I want to talk about today is EV awareness and knowledge. So we had mentioned that increases in experience of an EV is correlated with a likelihood and a willingness to make an individual's next purchase be an EV. By creating opportunities for low-income communities of color to experience an electric vehicle, whether it is riding in one or driving it themselves, diverse communities can become more aware and knowledgeable about EVs and feel more comfortable with making their next vehicle purchase zero emission. This is something that EVHybridNoire, my organization, is consistently focused on pushing forward. So we're engaged with a number of different partners to help ensure that EV awareness becomes widespread, especially in communities that have awareness and knowledge gaps currently. So one easy example of how we're doing this is by hosting ride and drive events in diverse communities. Something that we do annually during the National Drive Electric Week, which EVHybridNoire co-sponsors with Plug-in America, Sierra Club, and the Electric Vehicle Association, is we bring EVs to test drive for people who have never driven or owned an EV before. Doing this makes the technology much more accessible for these communities as they get to experience it, as they get to feel it, as they get to ask their questions and have their questions answered, even on a basic level about how do you charge an EV? What is that process like? How is an EV different? How does it drive differently from a gasoline vehicle? All of these questions are crucial to people's decisions on whether or not they're going to purchase their next car as a gasoline vehicle, a hybrid vehicle, or a zero-emission electric vehicle. So with that said, this brings me to a challenge that I want to leave with all of you. So each of you in the audience are members or affiliated with Interfaith Power and Light somehow, and are likely a member of a local religious community or even just a local non-affiliated community in your area. This means that you all have access to people that may have never heard or even learned much about EVs themselves and the benefits of owning one. So my challenge to you today is to share something you've recently learned about electric vehicles. It could be something that I shared in this webinar about the benefits of electric vehicles on health, on community health, individual health, or it could be something about the number of charging stations that are going to be coming into play in the coming years, whether that's through government funding or private funding. But I want you to share something you've recently learned about EVs to your community or individuals in your community. By increasing that knowledge and awareness for all groups about EVs, by talking about these things more, by talking about the benefits, even talking about the challenges, talking about the inequities that are taking place today and how we must move forward to make sure that those inequities do not persist, we can start to bridge those gaps and accelerate EV adoption in the US. So as I kind of draw to a close, promoting equity in the electric vehicle market is an important issue that we need to start to address in the early days of EV adoption. Electric vehicles have the potential to improve air quality and instill greater equity within our transportation system. However, in order to ensure that this transition is accessible to all communities, we need to address the challenges facing the electric vehicle market in the areas I discussed today were EV affordability, EV charging infrastructure, and EV awareness and knowledge gaps. We as a country cannot afford to make the same mistakes in the past that have hamstrung communities of color for decades. As we discussed at the start of the webinar, I think it's important to learn about these past historical inequities, such as redlining and the building of freeways and highways through communities of color, in order to better inform our future decision-making. History can be one of our greatest teachers, and as we expand the transportation space, as we transition the space to include more electric vehicles, there's a lot in our past, in our history that we can learn from and take into the future to ensure that we don't make those same mistakes and that we ensure more equity so that we ensure that communities of color, especially low-income communities, are not further marginalized by this transition. By implementing these strategies, such as government policies, equitable infrastructure investments, and education and outreach programs to disadvantaged communities, we can begin to close that gap and ensure that low-income communities are also a part of that transition to a future that includes clean energy, electric vehicles, and a healthier and more equitable world. And with that, I want to thank everyone for their time on this Thursday morning or afternoon, wherever you are. I want to thank Eileen and the Interfaith Power and Light team for inviting me to speak with you all on equity and electric vehicles. And if you have additional questions or want to connect with me, my email address is on the screen, so feel free to jot that down. I'd be happy to connect and answer any other questions that you may have. But with that said, we are going to have a Q&A time now that I'm happy to just take additional questions and open up the discussion.
All right, well, thank you so much for that presentation, Kevin. Super comprehensive, really appreciate it. And now it's time to pick your brain. So we've got some great questions in the chat here, as well as a couple questions that were emailed to me earlier. So let's start off by talking about charging access for apartment dwellers and how we can advance equity in that area. Because as we likely know, the vast majority of people actually charge their EVs at home. And it's much more affordable to do so, and it's way more convenient. So how do we advocate for chargers to be put in apartment complexes? And I do have some thoughts on this, so I'll add on once you share your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a huge part of the discussion today because, I think the data and research has shown that majority of EV owners prefer to charge at home. And, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's where people spend the most time. It's one of the most convenient places. And it's also one of the cheapest ways for people to charge their EV. With that said, apartment or condo unit dwellers, oftentimes multi-unit housing, they don't have EV charging in place. And so there are a number of policies that states are promoting to make sure that these apartment dwellers have that access. So there's right to charge laws that are coming through the pipeline in a variety of different states that mandate that apartment dwellers have to allow for those tenants to be able to charge their EV in their parking lot. In addition to that, we're also seeing a number of different programs. So I think there are more creative ways to approach this too. So not just talking about owning and driving your own EV, but something that EVHybridNoire co-sponsored was a bill in California that installed EV car sharing programs throughout the state, and especially in lower income communities. And those are also solutions that we can see coming up as more people there may be more communities that are reliant on public transportation and are not as interested, or EV or vehicle ownership just doesn't fit their lifestyle or their needs or their budget as well. And so seeing implementation of EVs into things like car sharing programs can even make it more accessible beyond just people who would typically buy a vehicle themselves.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That was a really comprehensive answer. And yeah, I just wanted to add on that actually one of our coalition partners, Vanessa Warheit at Plug in America, she is doing wonderful work regarding EV multi-family housing charging access. They're working in California specifically right now to pass some bills that, make sure that complexes are already fitted with the right electrical wiring and components so that chargers can be easily, put in instead of having to rip everything out. So basically making sure that new apartment complexes are already primed for electric vehicle charging. And yeah, this is definitely a complicated issue because there's a lot of both state level and municipal level laws to be considered, but there is great work happening in that space for sure.
Yeah, Eileen, I just want to add on to that, and thank you for bringing that up. I think what we've seen a lot around this conversation of EV charging in multi-unit housing is that it's oftentimes way cheaper to install, that EV charger up front, whether it's the upgrade to the infrastructure just to allow that, but it's way more economically beneficial to do that rather than come in after the fact and retrofit it to make sure that it meets the specs. So yeah, definitely a huge tactic that should be utilized moving forward too.
Yeah. We also have kind of a variety of questions surrounding critical mineral mining. And I also have some things to add on to this, but I guess, Kevin, how do we address the current inequity in hard rock mining, both in this country and abroad? And how do we shape our mining system to be more sustainable and more equitable for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a huge part of the conversation right now, especially around equity, because, ultimately mining leads to, you're uprooting land, and oftentimes it affects certain communities, whether, some of those communities can be sacred indigenous land. Some of those communities are just communities that are living near the sites that are going to be affected. And what we have seen is that mining can lead to a toxic environment, whether that's getting into the water supply or getting into the air as well. So definitely a huge part of that conversation. I think from what I've seen, there are a couple different things that are happening. So one is on the technology side. So there's a lot of innovative technology and research being done to ensure that mining is more sustainable and doesn't impact the communities as much as it currently does, whether that's through more effective ways to clean up that waste or to prevent it at the source so that the mining itself doesn't produce it in the first place. So I think there's a number of technologies that are looking to do that right now. And in addition to that, there's also the auto manufacturers are also recognize that this is a problem, both because, it's bad for the environment, and that's, I think it's bad on their brand, but it's also something that, consumers are pressuring corporations to also, take heed of. And so what we've seen, I think it was just in March of this year, Tesla made an announcement that they were going to remove all rare earths from their motors in their future generation vehicles. And so we've already seen this from some auto manufacturers like BMW as well, where they're removing rare earths so that they don't have to produce more of these mining of rare earths within that space, so that they can cut down that production and then make sure that they're utilizing materials that have less of these equitable concerns that a lot of people are bringing up.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with everything that you mentioned. And I also just wanted to flag that, there's actually a lot of really cool battery research being done out there that are actually moving towards not even using some of the most problematic critical minerals like cobalt. So that's really interesting. And also there's a lot of research being done in battery recycling, both for using, old batteries in different EVs, but also using batteries as solid state energy storage that's stationary after they've kind of exhausted their life in vehicles. In addition, one of the biggest problems with mining in the United States is that our mining laws are actually just celebrated their 150th birthday last year. So needless to say, they're a little bit out of date. So behind the scenes, IPL has been working on this, working on reforming these extremely outdated, it's the General Mining Law of 1872, if people are interested, making sure that those indigenous communities, because it is true that the vast majority of rare earth minerals in the United States are located near or on indigenous lands, making sure that those indigenous communities have what we call FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent about how the mining will be done, what are those impacts, and that is a huge priority for us going forward. So there definitely is an organized effort to ensure that mining becomes more sustainable. And I think, all the organizations that are involved in this front see EV adoption as a new horizon where we can make mining as clean as it can be going forward, and create a new, system where the people most impacted actually have a voice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that, Interfaith Power and Light is engaged on that side, because a lot of it is policy, whether it's the local state government or the federal government. We need to ensure that it's embedded into the policies so that we can ensure an equitable and sustainable future for EVs. Otherwise, there are going to be these challenges that are going to hinder that goal of instilling more equity through this transition.
Yeah. All right. Moving on to another question is about insurance, higher insurance costs, insurance companies having a tendency to total EVs if their batteries have some kind of issue. How do we deal with those problems?
Yeah, I think that is definitely an important concern is evolving discussion within this space as EVs become more widely adopted, and we're not just seeing the higher income individuals who are driving around Tesla Model S or whatever it is, but we're also seeing mass adoption by consumers. I think given that the EVs tend to have higher upfront costs, that will factor into that insurance being higher. But there are also cost savings when it comes to things like maintenance and gas that we all harp on a lot. And so I think that's a concern that we still have to figure out. I think it's an evolving discussion with the insurance companies as they figure out how to insure EVs properly, because this is, I think we need to recognize that this is also still a new space for them. And I think this is something that that is going to evolve as more EVs become widely adopted in the US. But I think definitely a good concern.
Cool. And I guess this is a question that I saw at some point and have now lost in the Q&A, but how can we help advocate for other kinds of micro e-mobility, like e-scooters, e-bikes? How can we do that? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think, so for example, I had previously mentioned EVHybridNoire recently co-sponsored a bill in the California Congress to install EV car sharing in programs. So it was to create a grant so that certain communities can get money from that grant to start these types of programs. And I think it's super important to expand the conversation beyond just like electric vehicles, because, you know, as a former transportation professional, I recognize that vehicles are not the only way that people get around. You know, there are other alternatives like, you know, walking, biking, you know, public transit, depending on, you know, your city, whether it's buses or metro. And so that's all a part of the conversation. So EVHybridNoire is also engaged in wanting to ensure more school buses or public transit buses are also moved to electric as well, or at least, you know, perhaps hydrogen or natural gas to reduce their emissions. And so these are all, you know, important parts of the conversation. And I think the more that we can advocate for them as organizations such as EVHybridNoire or Interfaith Power and Light, the more that we also, you know, utilize this technology. I think, you know, I remember the first time I rode like a bird scooter in Los Angeles. It was, you know, completely new experience, and it was a lot of fun, but also kind of like scary of like, do I need to wear a helmet, all of that. But, you know, recognizing that these are also, you know, alternative mobility options that we can become more comfortable with, and embracing that technology is also going to be, you know, a helpful part of the conversation as we move towards electrifying all things, not just automobiles.
Cool. Yeah, great answer. Thank you so much. And I'll throw in one of my own questions for you now, which is, how do you think faith communities can more deeply engage with this issue of, you know, electrification?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great question. I think you have to start with, you know, what's kind of like the major push for electric vehicles? Well, there's a couple of things. First is, you know, climate change and what we're seeing from CO2 emissions around the world, leading to more natural disasters, leading to greater, you know, just extreme weather patterns across the US and also globally. And recognizing that we have this one planet that we must take care of, whether it's for ourselves, for our children, for future generations. And I think as a faith community, you know, as someone who has also been a part of the faith community in the past, I think what I love the most about being a part of that is that you're looking out for one another. You're looking out for each other. You're looking out for people who, you know, maybe aren't your friends or aren't your family, but they're in your community and you care about them. I think we can translate that to this discussion as well, recognizing that, you know, even the neighborhoods that are next to ours, or even the neighborhoods that are being affected by typhoons in Asia, or, you know, in other places where maybe it feels really far off, but recognizing that as we transition to a more sustainable and electrified future, we can save some of these extreme weather events, wildfires, things like that. And just recognizing that, you know, we all have a responsibility to be a part of that transition. And so that's what I would share. But I know, Eiley, you know, as someone from Interfaith Power and Light, I'm sure you guys have plenty of thoughts on this as well.
Yes, for sure. I just wanted to hear what you had to say. And I totally agree that, you know, faith communities are very intentional communities, and therefore they're a great way to communicate about transportation in a way that feels very personal and one-on-one, which is, I think, really important when discussing this issue. And something that I would love to see more faith communities do, and actually some faith communities in our network have been taking on, is hosting EV ride and drives at their congregations. You know, a nice Saturday, just having people who own EVs or what have you, organizing those opportunities, I think is really meaningful. And I think that's a great way that faith communities can get involved. And I noticed a question that was sent to me in the chat was about the grid, which is a common concern that many people have, which is, so Kevin, how do you think that our grids, plural, are prepared for the additional demand for EVs? And if not, how can it be strengthened?
Yeah, I think the conversation and like the narrative around the grid and the strain that electric vehicles will place on the grid, I think it's a little bit alarmist in a lot of times. Trying to compare what the projected load of if everyone electrified to small cities or things like that. But ultimately, I think this is something that is going to take time to happen, and these utility companies, energy companies are going to be ready for it. They're already making plans to make sure that they're ready for it. They're installing different strategies to ensure that they can handle these loads, whether it's having people charge during off-peak hours or just increasing their own capacity. I think something else that we're seeing along the policy conversation and also technology front is the vehicle to grid or vehicle to everything technology from that are being implemented in a lot of EVs today. It's already in some vehicles like Hyundai's EVs already have vehicle to everything. And so that's the idea that not only can the grid charge your vehicle, but the grid can also borrow electricity from your vehicle when your vehicle has excess capacity or is not being utilized. And that's actually a really smart way for a lot of utility and energy companies to save on the energy loads, because it allows them to be more flexible, allows them more options, and it kind of decentralizes in a way the grid, so that every EV is also able to store battery that can be used for a blackout when that happens, or perhaps it can be used just during any certain types of emergencies. And so it allows the grid to be a lot more flexible when you look at it that way. And so I think the vehicle to everything technology is still not being enforced, but I know there are definitely conversations around getting that mandated through government policies.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. All great answers. So, as I mentioned before, IPL is absolutely dedicated to advocating for a rapid transition to clean and accessible EVs, but we do also work to support other forms of transit, including public transportation and walking and biking infrastructure. And we understand that all of these types of transportation are essential for a safe climate future. So in addition to supporting a variety of clean transportation infrastructure, this is actually a momentous time in terms of EPA rules and regulations. Both clean car, so light duty standards, and heavy duty trucks, buses, and so forth, both sets of those standards are on the table right now as proposed rules at EPA. And this is really a momentous occasion for us to advocate for these rules to be stronger, which not only accelerates EV adoption, but we're also advocating for EPA to clean up regular internal combustion engine vehicles, because we understand that those are still being sold and they have long lives once they're out on the road. So we've been hard at work calling on EPA to establish robust clean car and truck standards, and we would really appreciate your help and support in this work. This work also helps tackle many of the equity issues that we've discussed today, such as the disproportionate vehicle pollutants many communities of color face, and we've been really intentional in trying to keep justice as a focus for this work as we advocate before EPA. So I'm just going to drop a couple links in the chat that will direct you to some comment forms where you can personally send a comment to EPA telling them basically to enact robust clean car standards. So again, thank you everyone for attending today and being a part of this important conversation. Thank you, Kevin, for your dedicated advocacy and this really wonderful presentation. As a reminder for everyone, we have recorded this webinar. Never fear, we will be sending it out. and it will be posted to YouTube, our YouTube, Interfaith Power and Light. So we will be sending out the recording very shortly, as well as any relevant links that we might have. And if you have any questions that we didn't cover, please send them to my email, which is Eiley, my name, @interfaithpowerandlight.org. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.